like to welcome you all to this program at the second day of the Sigtuna Litteraturfestival. And this conversation between Samar Yazbek and Emauel Sidea has got a title in Swedish, Gränser och gränslöshet i skuggan av ett krig. And here on stage we also have Linderman, the director of Sigtuna Foundation, and Helena Axelsson Fisk, and you will be helping us to have this conversation in Arabic and English, so we're very grateful for that as well. I think we should start with giving them a warm hand. Very welcome to everybody.
Thank you. I also would like to welcome all of you to this seminar, but it's my privilege to particularly welcome our two guests, Samar Yazbek and Emauel Sidea. I feel it as a privilege for me to be the moderator of this conversation, and I really look forward to hear what you have to convey and share with us. But first of all, I would just like to make a very brief presentation of the both of you. Samar Yazbek is a Syrian journalist and author and has been challenging the present regime in Syria and therefore now have to live and work in exile in Paris. Samar has received several different awards and prizes over the last 6 years. Most relevant and perhaps known for us in Sweden is perhaps that she has been awarded the Swedish Tucholsky Prize for her reports on the Syrian revolution. Emauel Sidea is a Swedish journalist and author. He has worked for the number of years at the Swedish weekly paper Veckans Affärer, but is presently working as a freelance journalist. And you seem to be doing fine.
Yeah.
Even if it's a tough business. Emauel has also been teaching at the School for Journalism and Media and Communication at Stockholm University. The point of reference for our dialogue here are these two books. Samars bok, Resan in i tomheten, en berättelse från Syrien. And Emauels book, Mannen från Harem. Both these books relate to the present situation in Syria. They are both very, very strong books, and I really encourage all of you to read them, to read both of them if you haven't done so yet. They will be for sale and to be signed after the seminar. These books describe the complex and devastating reality in a conflict that we hear about almost every day in the news. If we think it's difficult to understand the situation in Syria and what the conflicts are all about, these two books do not offer simple explanations. They give nuanced and multidimensional perspectives. They enrich rather than explain. You have written two books about the same reality. I would first of all like you to elaborate a bit on what your intentions were when you started the work on these two books. It's a dramatic work that you have gone through, both of you, with the facing serious risks. So there has to have been a strong motivation for you to work with these books. Samar, please.
Thank you. يعني أنا بعتقد دافعي بظن مختلف عن مانويل، لأنه الأساس اللي دفعني هالشيء هو كون شاهد على الحقيقة من أجل العدالة، من أجل تحقيق العدالة.
I think that my motivations might differ a bit from Emauel. I wanted to be a witness. I wanted to be a witness to reality in search of justice.
لأنه أنا من هداك البلد، أنا قادمة من هداك البلد، والقضية السورية بتعنيني كانت جزء من حلمنا بسوريا ديمقراطية قبل أن تتحول إلى حرب.
I am from that country and this issue touches me deeply. It was our dream, a dream of a free democratic Syria, and then it turned into a war.
And what did you have to do to write the book? You actually did 3 trips back to Syria from your safety in the exile in Paris.
Yeah.
What made you do such a stupid thing, such a
stupid thing.
such a dangerous thing?
Yeah, it's not a stupid thing.
No,
I think
not,
it's something you have. I will speak in Arabic. Sorry. أنا بعتقد إنه هذا جزء من الدور اللي أنا كنت جزء من ما يحصل في سوريا من الثورة السورية، وكان هذا استكمال لدوري من إن نكون جزء من حركة الشعب اللي كان عم بيطالب بالديمقراطية. فالعودة لسوريا كانت هي جزء من هويتي كمثقفة وككاتبة وكسورية أيضاً.
It was a continuation of my role. I was part of the beginning of the revolution, and this was a way to continue to be part of a popular movement striving for democracy. It is part of my identity as a Syrian, as an author, and as an intellectual.
What did your friends think in Paris when you left? What did your daughter think when you left for the trips to Syria?
They think I'm crazy. And my daughter, she... actually, I don't want to speak about that.
Okay. No. Let's stay out of that. It's anyway. It's a very, very strong witness that you give us from the trips that you made in that area. Emauel, what made you do the work that you had to do this, and perhaps tell a little bit about the book.
Yes. Well, I'm obviously a journalist, so I did cover some of the other revolutions in Egypt and Libya, but I came very late. So when Syria happened, I felt that this is a story that I want to follow for quite some time. So I decided very quickly that I should cover this. So my motivation was, in a way, that this will be a good story or a important story. At that time, it didn't really... Nobody could see what would happen with the conflict. It was a revolution. And my motivation, I mean, it's a difficult question because you have to turn inwards to see why do you want to cover a revolution in a country that you don't really have a relation to. I'm not an Arabic-speaking person. I grew up in Sweden, although I'm born in Romania. So maybe the motivation is that I want to cover something that comes with a perspective from the outsider, and through journalistic methods covering a conflict that is important also for Swedes.
Yeah. Maybe I should say a few words about what the books are about, so you get sort of the context. Samar Yazbek's book is primarily relating to 3 trips from Paris, where Samar lives in exile, back to Syria. And Samar has then, in all these trips, been in all the very violent areas of the conflict, all the way up to the front lines, and have experienced the reality of people being exposed for bombings, for shellings, for every imaginable thing that comes in a war situation. And she basically tells the stories of the people that she meets in Syria during these 3 trips. And it's very touching to hear about people saying that, please let the world know. Please tell our stories so people know what's going on in Syria. Emauel's book is about fewer people but very interesting things, especially for us in many different ways. One of the key persons that Emauel describes is a smuggler in Syria, a person that ends up becoming a smuggler for various reasons, and then takes in people from other countries who want to join the Islamist forces in Syria. And for the purpose of that, you have been traveling to the borders between Turkey and Syria, and also within Syria.
Yes.
How many times did you go there?
I mean, I've done many trips, but I would say that I follow this Saif, who is the main character, and his relation into the war changes over time. So in periods I have had more reasons to travel more frequently there, because, and if you read the book you'll understand why, because there's some turn of events that forced me to travel there, basically.
Yeah. I would like to ask a general question about the style of writing for both of you. There are many connections between these two books. Both of you write about the conflict that we hear much about. You both primarily tell stories about people living in Syria. And the stories you tell are about the everyday life of people living in the midst of everything that takes place in Syria today. This is a reality filled with a degree of violence, terror, and hate that is difficult for us to understand. But at the same time, this reality is also filled with love and compassion, hope for the future, and many other dimensions of human life that we all share with the Syrian people. But there is, however, at least one big difference, and that is how you put yourself in the text. Samar, as I mentioned earlier, when reading your book, I almost had a feeling that I actually was reading poetry, but it was by far the most devastating poetry I have read in my whole life. Through the way you have chosen to write, our access to the stories that you tell are channeled through you in a very personal way. Even if I know that we cannot understand what you have gone through during your 3 trips back to Syria in a complete way, you still draw the reader very, very close, so we experience what the stories you're telling sort of through you, and become very identified with you in your book. Emauel, you have written, as far as I understand, in a very different way. You have chosen to step back much further yourself as a writer. You give us a close relation to the people whose stories you tell, but sort of directly between us and them, and not channeled through so much through your own feelings and experiences. I would like both of you to explain why you chose the strategy or the style for your books.
يعني أنا روائية، يعني أنا بالنهاية فنانة، وبالوقت نفسه أنا صحفية وناشطة بالمجتمع المدني وبحقوق المرأة، وكنت بشتغل بالتلفزيون والسينما، فعندي هويات متعددة. أنا كتبت الكتاب ضمن هوياتي المتعددة هي كلها.
I am a storyteller. I'm an artist, an author. I am also a journalist, and I am an activist. I've written for TV, I've written for cinema, and in a way this book combines all my different identities.
فأنا لما كتبت هذا الكتاب ما كتبته بطريقة وثائقية أو كما إنه وثيقة صحفية، أنا كتبته كروائية أيضا كفن، يعني كتبته كروائية ولكن حقيقة كان. فهذا الستايل أنا ما اخترته، هذا الستايل هو أنا، الحقيقة هو اختارني لأنه هذا أنا.
I didn't write a documentary, and I didn't write it as a journalist. I wrote it as a storytelling, but based all on truth. This is my style, but I didn't choose it. It chose me.
Emauel?
Yeah, I can agree that you don't choose the style, you just write it, and the way it ends up, it's the style you have. Although I'm not the important character in my book, so I should remove myself to the extent that I can, and that's because I want to let the characters that are in the book to be presented as clean as possible. But I understand that maybe I come into this project or into this book as a journalist that actually is trying to remove himself. Because I want the reader to have a good... the relationship should be between the reader and the character and not through me, although I am the writer. So it's a very difficult way, but I hope you understand that. And in a way, I couldn't have written it differently because...
It's different things, Sam. I'm
Yeah.
novelist and you are journalist.
Exactly.
And both of you convey stories in a very functional way, to put it that way. I mean, both the different styles of writing that you've chosen work, at least for me as a reader. I would like to ask you an impossible question, and that is to just give us a glimpse of a situation, a person, or something that you felt was very moving at some point during your work with these books, during your trips and so forth. I know that there must be overwhelmingly much to draw from, but just to give us a flavor of what you experience, if both of you could each give such a brief story.
What a horrible question. في كتير كان مشاهد مؤثرة، بس في مشهد أنا بالنسبة إلي بيضل مثل شاشة سينما بتتحرك قدامي طول الوقت هذا المشهد.
I have so many of these scenes, but there is one in particular that is constantly playing in my head, like a cinema screen.
شاشة. كانت الطيارة ألقت برميلين فوق أحد البيوت، ونحن كنا ذهبنا للإسعاف العائلة.
There was a plane and it had dropped 2 barrel bombs over a building, a residential building, and we rushed there to help the families.
كان الرجل صاحب البيت كان خارج البيت، لكن زوجته وأطفاله كانوا جوا، فكان هو مثل مجنون عم بيفوت بين الأنقاض وعم بيبحث عن أشلاءهم.
There was a man there and he was outside, but his wife and children were inside, and he kept running, trying to get between the help workers, rummaging through the rubble to try to find pieces of his loved ones.
فنحن كنا جوا عم ندور معه. أنا ما انتبهت إنه ما بيصير أنا فوت بين الأنقاض. فأنا وعم ببحث، هو كان عم يبكي، الرجل عم يبكي طول الوقت وعم بيدور، فانتشلوا جثة زوجته.
We were helping out, and I wasn't really aware that I wasn't supposed to be there, and the man was crying and he kept on looking, and all of a sudden he found his wife, the dead body of his wife.
فأنا كنت جنبه عم ببحث، فطلعوا بين إيدي أصابع بنته الصغيرة، وبعدين أنا انهارت تماماً. يعني طلعوا أصابع بس ما طلعوا الجثة تبعها، وأنا انهارت تمام، يعني غبت عن الوعي. هذا المشهد بالنسبة إلي كتير صعب.
I was there digging alongside with him when all of a sudden I found fingers in my hand. Only the fingers of his daughters. And I broke down completely and I fainted. And this is one of the hardest moments I've ever had.
Emauel?
I would say that when talking to people that I met and write about in the book, actually just to force them to re-experience the torture that they have been through by describing it to me. That was very difficult because, I mean, you ask them to actually describe every detail, and that's only for the benefit of the book, basically.
At some point in Samar's book, she writes that if I would have read this in a book, I wouldn't believe it. And it's, I can understand that. It's such a devastating reality. But I would say that both of you managed to bring me as a reader very close to the stories of the people that you're telling. And in that sense, you've both been very successful. I have a question about good and evil. In Emauel's book, you mentioned that Saif, at some point, when he's starting to struggle with the fact that I'm actually smuggling people who become members of Daesh or other parts of the Islamist fighting groups, that was troublesome for him, for obvious reasons, because he did not have his sympathies with these groups. He sort of had sympathies, pretended to have sympathies with everyone to be able to continue to work as a smuggler. And then this Saif says that you can do bad things and not being a bad person. And that brings up the issue of how do we deal with good and evil? How do we deal with right and wrong in the situation in the everyday lives of the Syrian people in today's Syria?
يعني أنا بعتقد الآن كتير صعب لأنه الأمور معقدة ومختلطة، وأنا بعتقد الخير والشر كتير مختلطين بالحياة، ما في خير مطلق ولا شر مطلق، يعني الشيطان ممتزج مع الله فيني أقول.
I think it is very, very difficult right now in Syria. It has become more and more complicated. And I also think that the good and evil have become intertwined. And I don't think there are any absolute goods or absolute evils. The devil and God live side by side.
بس فيني أحكي عن أسباب موضوعية لبداية هذا الشر الكبير الحاصل في سوريا.
But I can tell you about the reasons that led to these terrible evil that we now see in Syria.
أنا بعتقد النظام الدكتاتور، نظام بشار الأسد الدكتاتوري وصمت المجتمع الدولي كان بداية انفلات الشر في سوريا وما يحصل أيضا في العالم الآن من تفجيرات إرهابية. بتحمل مسؤوليته الأولى والأخيرة نظام الأسد المجتمع الدولي اللي ساكت عنه، لأنه نحن أمام سقوط أخلاقي كبير الآن.
I think that the dictatorial regime of Bashar al-Assad, but also the absolute silence of the international community, is what lets evil free reign. Not only in Syria, we see it everywhere in terror attacks all over. There is a complete collapse of morals, of human morals today, and that's what we see.
سقوط الأخلاقي الإنساني.
Total moral collapse.
I mean, Saif, in a way, was trying to, find a good reason to continue with his business. But in a way, I'm trying to, with my book, to ask this large question where, what would you have done in a conflict like this one? Would you have been the good one or the bad one? And your morals, what does that respond in terms of actions? And I think it's very difficult to say who is bad or who is evil and good, because we all have it in us to some extent, both parts, as you were mentioning that. So I think it's a very difficult question, and yeah.
And this is why I said that none of you give simple answers to the difficult questions, but both your books enrich our understanding of the situation. I can easily understand that it's very difficult to, in absolute terms, talk about good and evil in that situation, especially on the everyday life level for people who have to cope with reality as it is. But another dimension of this everyday life, one strong experience for me when reading both of your books is that in the midst of everything that is so impossible for me to understand, all the hate, violence, and sheer terror, we get to know people that in their lives are attending to things in their everyday lives in a similar way that we do, but with obviously different preconditions. Just one example, in Samar's book, there's a story about a woman who, in a very difficult situation, with violence, bombings, fighting going on, very, very close by in her own sort of context, have started a beauty clinic in her home. And this is a very touching story because it shows to me that in the drastic, dramatic reality in which they live, they seem to be able to uphold some sort of human dignity that is, it's almost hard to understand that they can do so. What was your experiences of this dimension of human dignity in the people that you met?
يعني قبل الكرامة فيني أحكي عن قوة الحياة، قوة الحب وقوة الأمل، وعن الشعب السوري عنده ثقافة حياتية وسلوكية يومية عالية.
We could talk a lot about the dignity, but before that we should talk about the power of love, the power of life, the power of culture. And the Syrians have a high standard of everyday life culture. That's who they were.
وهذا الشيء ما كتير مفهوم بالغرب، إنه هدول الناس من 4 سنوات يتعرضوا للقصف وللموت سيطرة الجهاديين على الأرض وقصف الأسد والروس من السماء، ومع ذلك هن مصرين يعيشوا كبشر حضاريين، يعني كبشر بيعنوا بالجمال، بيعنوا بالحب، بيعنوا بنظافة حياتهم، بسلوكهم. هن بشر على سوية إنسانية عالية. أنا حبيت أحكي هالقصص البسيطة اللي بتفرجي السوريين شو هن، اللي الإعلام ما بيشوفها هون.
There are so many people in the West who don't understand that even though the Syrian people have been bombarded, tortured, occupied by jihadists, bombarded by Assad and the Russians, there is still a high level of civil society. There is love, and there is beauty. The Syrians care for their hygiene still. They care about everything that goes around them. And I was it was important to me that I would show the Syrians as they really are, not the way they are portrayed by media, but this people who actually live with high morals, a civilized, moral people.
بس هي النقطة المهمة، إنه هدول بشر كانت مطالبهم الأساسية بالكرامة، وبإنهم ما يعيشوا كعبيد تحت ظل نظام الأسد، وهذا العقاب اللي نالوه لأنهم طالبوا بالكرامة.
So these are people who first and foremost asked for dignity. That's what they wanted. And the punishment they got for that was this reaction from the Bashar regime. But didn't want to live as slaves to a regime they had not chosen. This is why all this is happening.
وكان الجزاء تدمير سوريا وتقسيمها الآن وتحويلها لمجموعة أراضي بيحتلها قواعد عسكرية مختلفة. كتير مهم نفرجي الوجه الآخر للسوريين. نحن مو بس ضحايا، نحن لسنا ضحايا فقط.
So the punishment was this complete destruction of Syria, division of the country between different interested parties, military occupation by jihadists and military bases all over the country. But it was important to me that I show you that Syrians are not only victims.
In your book, Samar, there are many very touching stories about situation where there's bombings and fighting going on, and still people attend, for instance, to do the best food they can for you when you come as a visitor. They manage to get some meat, to get some vegetables, and sort of do things that you would do regardless of circumstances that for us would sort of say that it's impossible to do it. And that's, to me, that are examples on this significant human dignity. Did you experience the same, Emauel, with the people you met?
Yes, and I believe that, I mean, in a way, the reason for this and not, I mean, you have to realize that people have reasons for their fighting, and this is the reason, because as you were mentioning, that the dignity is the one they didn't get. So yeah, I mean, they try to live regular lives, and I mean, it doesn't, although the war is going on, they try to maintain in a way a normal life, even though the front might be quite close.
Yeah. We should turn over to a question that is a bit more sort of on principle level. It's a question that I find extremely interesting, and it concerns the role of religion in the Syrian conflict, as well as in other conflicts in the MENA region. As far as I understand, in a country like Sweden, we most of the time think that religion is not what it's all about. Religion is only used one way or the other for other purposes and to motivate people for fighting and so forth. But having read your books, again and again and again, people refer to what's going on as a religious war, a war between religious traditions. How can you explain what the role of religion is in the Syrian conflict?
يعني من المؤكد انه ما بدأ في سوريا لم تكن حرب دينية، اكيد بدأت ثورة سلمية نتيجة عنف الأسد وتدخل روسيا وإيران، ثم صمت المجتمع الدولي. صار في هذا العنف اللي حول لهذا الشكل.
What is absolutely for sure is that this started as a peaceful demonstration, and had it not been for the response of Bashar al-Assad, the Russians, the silence of the international community, we wouldn't have seen this circle of violence that has now been transformed into a religious conflict.
Let me see if you agree on this one.
Yeah.
In a way, I mean, as I understand this, is that people are religious driven in a way along the ethnic lines. That people perceive that even though they are part of the majority, they are not represented in the majority wise. I mean, the country is a Sunni Muslim in majority, but it's ruled by the Alawites.
No, I'm not agree with
okay,
you. But
that's why I was wondering.
بس أنا بدي أحكي شيء، كنت بدي أحكي إنه ما يبدو الآن غطاءه حرب دينية هو عمقه سياسي واقتصادي وعسكري أيضاً. اقتسام مصالح دولية داخل سوريا بغطية الدين، وهذا يحصل دائماً في التاريخ.
I would like to say that even when it seems like a very strong religious conflict, at the bottom of it, we have political, military, and economic interest, and an international community that has always fought for these interests under the guise of religion.
بالحديث انه عن العلويين والسنه يعني من المؤكد انه نظام حافظ الاسد وبشار الاسد استخدموا العلويين كمثل وقود او استخدموهم من اجل الحفاظ على مصالحهم، يعني خوفوهم، وكان جزء من عمليه استمرت لنصف قرن لم تبدا في الثوره.
When it comes to the division between the Alawites and the Sunnis, the Assad family, father and son, have always utilized the Alawite community, and they have scared them. They have used propaganda to scare them for 50 years now.
أنا ما فيني أقول إنه العلويين هن اللي بيحكموا، هذا كلام كتير بسيط. الموضوع في سوريا معقد أكثر من ذلك. في تصالح، اتفاق مصالح مع الرجال رأس مال السني مثلا بين بشار الأسد وبين نظامه مثلا على سبيل المثال.
It is far too simplified to say that the Alawites are ruling the country. It's simply not true. For instance, there are many economic deals between the Assad family and very successful Sunni businessmen.
اللي بدي أقوله إنه لما بدأت الثورة الناس طلعت ما كانت لا طائفية ولا يعني لم تكن شعاراتهم طائفية، بدأوا إنه غالبيتهم من السنة لأنه أكثرية الشعب السوري سنة.
When the revolution started, it was not started by along ethnic lines. It never was. There was a majority of Sunnis participating in the demonstrations because the majority of the population is Sunni.
هلا أكيد الصراع محركه طائفي وديني، بس أنا بدي أحكي أعطيكم حادثة حصلت معي قبل 3 سنوات ونصف.
For sure, nowadays the struggle or the fight has turned into something ethnical, something religious. But I just want to tell you something that happened to me 3 years ago.
كنت أنا على خط الجبهة بريف إدلب، وكنت هاي خط الجبهة كانوا مقاتلين، ولما عرفوا مين أنا واحد منهم حط الكلاشينكوف حتى علي هون وقال لي أنا بدي أقتلك، أنتوا ذبحتونا، أنتوا قتلتونا، لأنه أنا من دين مختلف يعني عنهم. فقلت له إذا بدك تقتلني تصرف، أنت حر، إذا بترتاح، إذا بترجع لنا سوريا يلا اقتلني وخلينا نرتاح. صار يبكي الشاب، صار يبكي مثل الأطفال، ورمى الكلاشينكوف وراح.
I was on the front line and I was talking to the fighters there. It was on the countryside outside of Idlib. And when they found out who I was, they put a Kalashnikov to my breast and said, I have to kill you. You have slaughtered all of us. And I told him, go ahead. If that brings us Syria back, go ahead. And he threw his gun to the ground and started crying like a child.
It was. بس هدون شعب الأسد عم يقصفون، العالم كله عم تقصفون. الأتراك، الحدود التركية فتحت أمام كل الجهاديين ليحتلوا أرضهم، لأنهم منهم سوريين بدأوا يحتلوا أرضهم. يعني شو مطلوب من الشعب السوري؟ الآن عم بيتعرض لإبادة، وبنرجع بنقول حرب دينية. ليست حرب دينية بالمعنى الحقيقي. لازم دائما نقول إنه ما يحصل في سوريا حرب اقتصادية، عسكرية، سياسية، غطاء ديني. هذا كتير مهم، هذا أنصاف للشعب السوري.
The Syrians have been bombed by Assad. They have been bombed by the world. Turkey left its borders open for any jihadists to cross and become part of an occupying force in Syria. What do you want the Syrian people to do? What can they do? The least we should do is be careful not to call this war religious, but to call it for what it is, an economic, military, political war that is fought in Syria.
I agree on that.
Thank you.
But also, I want to add that it's also, to understand the conflict, you have to understand that, in my perspective at least, that Syria has become a field where a lot of interests meet.
Yeah.
So in a way, the religious groups use it as a playing field for fighting against groups that they, I mean, in a way...
They use the group jihadis to do that. They use...
Exactly. So in a way, it's both right and wrong that is a religious war in terms of...
Yes, أنا قلت هيك.
That's what I said.
It's part of... But we have to understand. لازم نعرف ليش هيك صار.
We have to know why this has happened.
يعني مشان ما نضل نقول نحن مشكلتنا بالجهاديين فقط وإنه هدول جهاديين خلقوا من الفراغ. من وين اجوا الجهاديين؟ مين صنعهم؟
We can't go on pretending that the jihadists is our only problems. There were problems before, and where did these guys come from? Why are they here? Why have they appeared? If we don't know that, we cannot know.
ما اجوا من الفراغ.
They did not come out of nowhere.
كيف يصنع تطرف في العالم؟ كيف؟ من يصنع تطرف في العالم؟
How is terrorism produced, manufactured, and who does the manufacturing of terrorism? That's the question.
لما بيكون بلد ما فيها ديمقراطية، لما بيكون بلد ما فيها تعليم، ما فيها حقوق إنسان، ما في بطالة، لما بيكون في ديكتاتوريات قائمة على القمع، بينشأ التطرف.
Where you have countries that are left without democracy, that are living under dictatorship, without education, without human rights, with no prospects for work, that's when you get terrorism.
I have a background as a sociologist of religion, and to me it is scary when everyday people talk about a conflict as a religious conflict, because that makes the conflict absolute in a sense that it otherwise doesn't necessarily need to be. We are not having tremendously much time left, but could you just reflect a little bit, very briefly, on the role of the international community? For me, it appears to be very, very troublesome that a country so close to Europe, so close to us, ends up in a situation and being sort of left as a victim by the rest of the world. What are your comments, having been so close to the situation in Syria? Emauel.
Yeah. I mean, many people of which I talked to and I write about in the book mention this fact that nobody cares about us, and these horrible things that happen to us, the international community has let us down in a way, and we are forced to do many things that just to respond to this tremendous terror that is by the Assad regime. And I mean, for example, one case where they mentioned about the chemical attacks, where, I mean, if you would have a chemical attack anywhere else in the world, the international community would stand up and say that this cannot be continued. The conflict has to find a solution. You have to end this. But in Syria, there was some steps, but the international community didn't really respond properly, and that would have ended the conflict in a way, or at least would have had some kind of solution or different development that we have seen today.
I think this is important because we are all part of the rest of the world. We are all part of the world that has resigned from our responsibility to be with the brothers and sisters in Syria. And that's a good thing for us to sort of reflect upon. What can we do? I know that we live in a completely different context, but it's still a challenge to all of us. Just briefly to end this session, a few comments on your hopes and fears for the future.
I let Emauel because he is more youngest than me.
But I'm equally depressed, I think. No, but I would say that unfortunately there's no end in sight, and that's quite depressing. And the people you talk to doesn't really feel any optimists. I mean, the future isn't very bright for them, and that corresponds actually to the previous question about the response from the people outside of Syria, that nobody really seems to. This is the new normal, basically, that there should be a war in Syria, and that's just goes along the way. And I think we have to decide at some point that, okay, now it has to end. The international community has to stand up and say, like, okay, it has been going on too long. And I think the Syrians, and this would be interesting to hear, that everybody's tired of the war now.
Yeah, it's true.
Do you have any comment on your own hopes and fears for the future?
No.
Well,
أنا بعتقد الحرب رح تكون شوي طويلة، بتمنى توقف، بس على ما يبدو في قرار لاستمرار آلة الحرب، وقرار لبيع السلاح بشكل دائم، قرار الاستيلاء على النفط، البترول، قرار على موارد المياه، لأنه بدهم يستولوا على الموارد المائية، الأنهار، بدهم عم بيضيفوا قواعد عسكرية جديدة، عم بيعملوا تغيير ديموغرافي بسوريا. نحن أمام مستقبل أسود الآن.
Yeah. I am sorry to tell you that I believe the war is still ongoing for a long time. I would hope for it to end, but it seems the international community and everybody has decided that it is more important today to keep the war going, to keep the arms trade going, to keep jostling for the power of oil, to make sure that one part or the other gets hold of all the water resources. We see the military bases growing up everywhere in Syria, a total demographic transformation of the country.
in these 45 minutes, you have been able to share a lot of very, very important and interesting thoughts together with us. And for all of those who want to read more, you can turn to the books. But for now, thank you so much, Samar and Emauel. I think we give them a warm hand.
Thank you.